Beneath a crimson Roman twilight, a forgotten machine sits beneath tattered canvas and silence. Its sinews, once taut with death, now droop like the tired veins of an aging beast. Soldiers pass it by without acknowledgment, but the old ones, the ones with scars under their armor and secrets behind their silence, avert their gaze. The ballista does not rest. It remembers. Long before the cannons and gunpowder, long before the clashing of bronze shields in phalanxes, there was the Woundmaker, part machine, part myth. It whispered across stone walls and rained lightning into the hearts of men. It wasn't just a siege engine, it was a spiritual instrument of judgment, forged by minds that saw geometry not as numbers, but as divine symbology. Legends say that every ballista was born under ritual, that it could only be assembled under moonlight, and its sinew cords must be wound while prayers to Mars were chanted. Each bolt fired was believed to steal a name, erasing men from memory as if they had never existed. The silence after its shot was sacred, a mourning of flesh and stone alike. Children born near ballista forges were marked. Some believed the metal's hum entered their dreams. In border towns, peasants whispered that ballistae could choose their own targets. Some soldiers claimed they misfired on purpose, refusing to kill those the gods had not marked. In the Vatican's deepest vaults, there exists a scroll, unnamed, unsigned, written in blood and ash. It reads, "The ballista does not fire for man, it fires for consequence." As this video begins, and we step back into an age where war was faith and bolts flew like prophecy, remember, the Woundmaker still waits, and tonight it speaks again. Before the screen even fades in, the viewer hears it, a slow winding sound, like sinew tightening over ancient wood. Then silence, then the crack of air being torn apart. The frame opens to a soldier, frozen mid-scream, eyes skyward. Something enormous hurls through the mist above, trailing flame and death. This is not a modern weapon. There are no engines, no turbines, no metal casings. What flies above is raw, wooden, twisted from gut and discipline, born from ancient rage. A ballista bolt, 12 feet of sharpened judgment, sails overhead. Then a hard cut. The bolt slams into a distant watchtower. Stone explodes outward like shattered bone. The camera pushes in, not on the rubble, but on the mechanism. The ballista itself, coils still vibrating, smoke curling from the frame. This is how you open a tale not of war, but of true will. Rome didn't invent death, but it did perfect its double asterisk delivery system. And the ballista to the Romans was more than a weapon. It was a gesture from the gods. A mechanical spell carved into oak and iron. It didn't just kill, it pronounced fate. By the 5th second, the viewer must already feel hunted. Not by a person, but by a precision centuries ahead of its time. Then narration begins, low and reverent. In the empire of eagles and ambition, one machine whispered louder than armies. It moved no gears, but the world shifted when it spoke. It was the ballista, and it remembered where you stood. What follows is not just a documentary. It is a haunting, and the shadow it casts will stretch across your screen, across centuries, and across you. The story of the ballista does not begin with Rome. It begins in the murmurs of older civilizations, in the shadows of Greek cities where mathematicians whispered to woodworkers and warriors watched ideas become instruments. The Greeks gave birth to the oxybels, a belly-powered crossbow that first introduced the idea of torque and tension as force. But even earlier, the Assyrians and Egyptians were experimenting with lever-based propulsion, slings, and fire-hardened projectiles. The ballista was not a single invention. It was an inheritance, refined through centuries of war and wonder. What Rome did was elevate this mechanical lineage into art. With the rise of the Republic and then the Empire, Roman generals saw the value of siege craft not merely as destruction, but as domination of time and space. The ballista became an extension of Roman philosophy. Discipline over chaos, geometry over guesswork. Each design iteration brought improvement. The torsion springs evolved from simple sinew to bundles of twisted hair and tendon, wound tight with rituals known only to trained engineers, men who were not called soldiers, but architecti bellicae, gast, architects of war. Cultural lore surrounded these creators. Many were said to sleep with their blueprints beneath their pillows for fear that the designs would leak into dreams and be stolen by other empires. Some believed that if a blueprint were burned, the memory of the ballista would still linger in the ash. One surviving scroll from the Vitruvian archives details the crafting of a ballista named Aquila, or the Eagle. It was said that Aquila once launched a bolt over 700 paces, crossing a river and killing a barbarian chieftain during a parley. A statement from Rome, not in words, but in wood and fury. But these were not just weapons of conquest. They were instruments of communication, of philosophy. When a ballista was assembled on foreign soil, it was not merely to win. It was to demonstrate that Roman order had arrived. And when it fired, it wasn't just an attack. It was a proof of concept, that the empire's ideas were as powerful as its legions. Thus was born the thunderbolt, not from lightning in the sky, but from the minds of engineers who bent nature itself into discipline. And in that fusion of form and force, Rome found its voice, loud, precise, and impossible to ignore. To understand the ballista is to understand a machine built not just for war, but for wonder. It was as if a philosopher had designed a predator. At its core, the ballista operates on torsion, two tightly wound bundles of sinew, twisted and secured into a wooden frame. Arms made of yew or ash are inserted through the sinew coils. When drawn back with a winch, energy is coiled into the machine like breath before a roar. The release sends the projectile flying, not with chaotic force, but with focused fury. But the devil is in the details. Roman engineers used precise ratios. When calculating arm length, sinew tension, and the trajectory path, the bolts, some tipped with iron, others with bronze, were weighted for balance, flight stability, and penetration. They were tested in controlled trials, sometimes launched at sheets of cowhide, wooden shields, and even dead livestock to measure impact. Blueprints unearthed near Herculaneum show notation akin to modern ballistic math. They include arc angles, sine curves, and equations based on trial and error. These were not primitive guesses. These were proto-physics. More astonishing was the modularity. Ballistae came in different sizes: small Scorpios for targeting individual soldiers, medium field ballistae for ranks, and massive city siege variants that hurled projectiles the size of tree trunks. They could be disassembled and transported, then reassembled in under half a day. And then there was the chu sound, da. Witnesses described a deep vibration followed by a bone-shaking crack, not a bang like gunpowder, but something closer to nature rebelling. Birds would flee before the shot. Horses bucked in fear. Veterans said they could feel a ballista's tension from across the field, like standing too close to lightning. It wasn't just engineering, it was a presence. Craftsmen who built ballistae weren't mere technicians. They were inducted into a brotherhood, sworn to secrecy. It was believed that revealing the ratios of tension to a non-initiate brought misfortune, even death. One story tells of a Roman engineer who whispered secrets to a rival and was later found in the Tiber, his tongue removed, his hand still clenched as if holding a crank. What made the ballista so haunting wasn't just its killing power. It was the poor calm before the storm. The perfection behind the destruction. It was math given muscle, precision forged into punishment, and Rome wielded it like a sculptor wields a chisel, not to destroy, but to shape the world. The ballista was not merely built, it was summoned. Assembly of the great war machine was treated as a ritual, especially during major campaigns. While the components, arms, frame, sinew coils, trigger mechanism could be transported separately in carts, their reassembly followed a strict sequence that blended engineering with ceremony. Before construction began, engineers would draw a chalk circle on the earth, said to align with Roman geomantic patterns. This wasn't for accuracy alone. It was believed the circle invited discipline into chaos, preventing the spirit of war from escaping the weapon's core. The senior engineer, known as the Magister Tormentorum, would chant the Forma Invocata, an oath to Mars, god of war, asking for clarity of hand and purity of aim. His assistant would carry a scroll, marked not only with schematics, but with glyphs to ward off misalignment. Each component was handled as though sacred. The wooden arms, carved from seasoned yew, were often branded with symbols, eagles, laurels, or the names of past victories. The sinew coils, soaked in oil and ash, were laid with the care of winding a funeral shroud. Tensioning the coils was considered the most dangerous and revered step. Only certain engineers were allowed to handle the winches. A misstep could snap a coil and kill a man instantly. Those who performed this step successfully were given the title Tensors of Silence, for their work often went unthanked, yet their failure meant disaster. A finished ballista was draped with a red cloth until its first use, symbolizing its dormant wrath. Soldiers were told not to speak directly to it until it had been fired once, a superstition that it must taste blood before accepting commands. One camp account tells of a ballista that refused to fire until a raven landed upon it, seen as a blessing from Mars. When it finally loosed its first bolt, it struck a general's tent over half a league away. Coincidence, perhaps, but such coincidences shape the legends. In battle, to witness a ballista emerge from its cloak was to feel the balance of power shift. Even before it fired, its mere presence signaled that Rome had not only arrived, it had declared order upon the chaos. The ritual of assembly was thus more than preparation. It was invocation, a promise between empire and mechanism, and once spoken, it could not be unmade. To operate a ballista was not simply a matter of strength or skill. It was a calling. The soldiers tasked with commanding and firing these divine machines were selected not just for their technical prowess, but for their temperament. They were known among the legions as sacerdotes feri, gam, or priests of iron. These men trained in both engineering and martial discipline. Each learned to interpret wind, weight, and distance as if reading omens. In their hands, the ballista became not a weapon, but an oracle of violence. Before each engagement, the operators would anoint the throwing arms with a salve of oil, ash, and blood, a symbolic blend representing life, death, and resurrection. They would chant brief incantations from the Liber Bellum, a manual said to contain more poetry than instruction. It was believed that these verses harmonized the spirit of the ballista with the intent of its operators. Every operator had a ritual. Some tapped the side of the frame 3 times before firing. Others whispered the name of a fallen comrade. A few remained completely silent, except to utter audit, Latin for hear me, as they released the bolt. The ballista team worked like a choir. One cranked, one loaded, one aligned the aim, but only one, the cue octor, gave the command to fire. This was the spiritual leader of the machine. If the bolt flew true, he received the credit. If it failed, he bore the shame. Some legions believed that ballistae had moods. A sluggish aim or misfire wasn't blamed on mechanics, but on tisitseu, displeasure. If too many bolts missed, offerings were made: coins, hair, blood from the operator's hand. Superstition? Perhaps, but these rituals forged trust between man and mechanism. In written records from the Dacian campaigns, one ballista team was known as Vox Fulminis, voice of thunder. Their bolts struck with such consistency that their crew was never rotated, even after years. The Octor's final journal contained this chilling line: "When I stand beside her, I feel not fear, but judgment. She knows who deserves the bolt. I only aim." To be a ballista operator was to embrace silence, precision, and fate. They were not merely soldiers. They were interpreters of war's will. In the twilight zone where myth meets mechanism, the ballista stood as both marvel and mystery. For all its visible engineering, there remained stories, whispered by soldiers, scribes, and even enemies, that defied explanation. Some believed that the ballista was more than a weapon, that it housed a spirit forged in fire and oath, woken by the tension of its cords. One such tale tells of a ballista stationed at a mountain pass during a snowstorm. The crew had perished, frozen mid-task. And yet, when a barbarian warband approached, witnesses swore the ballista fired a single bolt unaided, killing the chieftain and halting the advance. The machine stood still after that, encased in ice, untouched, revered as a sentinel by both sides. Another legend speaks of Nocturna, a ballista said to fire only under moonlight. Its bolts glowed faintly, and its targets were always struck through the heart, even through armor or stone. Roman engineers insisted it was merely coated with phosphorus and honed by veteran aim. But even they avoided working on Nocturna alone. Mechanically, some innovations did blur the line between genius and witchcraft. Ballistae, with adjustable recoil dampeners made of soaked leather strips. Trigger mechanisms that used embedded bronze teeth to count rotations and ensure power consistency, a primitive algorithm. Engineers refer to such designs as muta forma, shifting forms, as if the machines evolved with every battle. The soldiers who served around ballistae believed they could sense changes in the machine's mood. One night, it might hum like a lute string. Another, it might creak like a coffin lid. They'd adjust rituals accordingly: silence before dawn shots, laughter after dusk volleys, even placing wildflowers on the base to sweeten the gods of aim. Rival civilizations, especially those in the north, often believed the ballista was powered by Roman necromancy, that the tendons were from the fallen, or that incantations bound their spirits to the machine. Roman scribes scoffed at these notions, but some scrolls were oddly vague on where exactly the sinew came from. Perhaps the most telling artifact is a bronze plaque found buried under a collapsed fortress. On it, in perfect Latin, a phrase is etched: "Do not aim with your eye, aim with your blood." Whether metaphor or manual, myth or method, the ballista transcended its bolts. It became the crossroad where gears met ghosts. One ballista was a message, but a formation of ballistae was a chorus, and Rome used them like a liturgy of thunder. In large-scale sieges, ballistae were arranged not as brute machines, but as orchestral voices, each tuned to a different pitch of destruction. Smaller ones targeted enemy archers, mid-sized models broke gates and parapets, and the monstrous polybolos, repeating ballistae, laid waste to walls with methodical rhythm. The engineers responsible for this synchronization were not tacticians in the traditional sense. They were kiku, choreographers of calamity. From elevated platforms, they would signal the timing of releases with horn calls, flame bursts, or mirrored sunlight. Each signal meant a different mode: staggered fire, simultaneous volley, or precision strike. Witnesses described the effect as hypnotic, a storm not of chaos, but of structure. One Greek historian, captured and later employed as a translator, wrote, "It was not battle. It was theater. The ballistae did not fight. They sang." Ballistae in formation would sometimes fire in sequences that mimicked the cadence of Roman marching chants, not for strategy, but for morale. The sound of each bolt slamming into fortifications echoed with a rhythm that stirred the hearts of legionnaires and struck fear into their enemies. Defenders, upon hearing the first volleys, often fled before the gates were breached. Each formation had a name: Umbra Manus, the shadow hand; Ordo Tonitris, the order of thunder. These were not just battlefield positions. They were reputations. Coordination required absolute discipline. One misfire could destroy alignment, jam reload cycles, or worse, strike an allied unit. Training drills lasted weeks. During a campaign in Gaul, it is said that ballistae were practiced under artificial storms, created with leather drums and water-poured siege roofs, simulating rain and wind conditions. To be caught in the open during a full choir's volley was considered worse than death. It was erasure. A man hit by a ballista bolt was not merely wounded, he was unmade. The formation's final effect was psychological. Even if they missed, the pattern of their fire would draw the eye, break the mind, and carve anxiety into enemy ranks. For Rome, this was not excess. This was elegance in violence. It begins with stillness. The bolt, resting in the ballista's cradle, is nothing but potential. A sharpened beam of wood, often tipped with iron or bronze, sometimes barbed or forked. Its body is waxed, its fletching trimmed, its shaft etched with runes or numerals denoting batch and purpose. The moment of release is thunderless, yet immense. The torsion coils unwind, arms snap forward, and the cradle kicks, launching the bolt not just as a projectile, but as a verdict. Observers say the bolt disappears, not because of speed, but because of how the eye refuses to follow something so fatal. In flight, it hums, a deep, resonant tremor in the air. Birds scatter, grass bows. Striking a man, the bolt rarely stops. It passes through shield, mail, bone, and into the soul of the line behind him. One Gaulish account tells of a single bolt impaling 2 soldiers and embedding itself in a chariot wheel, stopping both flesh and momentum. Against stone, the bolt shatters, but even in shattering, it wounds. Splinters fly like cursed arrows. Some veterans carried shields with deep gouges, not from swords, but from fragments of failed bolts that struck harder than warhammers. There were specialty bolts too. The sibilantes, whistling tips carved with holes, said to scream in flight and terrify mounts. The triplex, triple-bladed heads used to cut through rope bridges or sever siege ladders. And the cauterics, iron tips soaked in pitch, then lit and launched, designed to both pierce and burn. The path of a ballista bolt was studied with near religious fervor. Engineers marked sandpits, tested different woods, calculated arc drops. Some even used augurs, diviners, to interpret the first impact in symbolic terms. But beyond all this, science lay the core truth. A ballista bolt was Rome's handwriting. Where it struck, the empire had signed its name. There are stones in ancient fortresses still bearing the dents of these bolts. Bones in burial sites split cleanly down the center, and scrolls that describe the shadow of a bolt passing overhead as the finger of Mars himself. To be within its path was not to face death. It was to be edited out of history. Some fortresses were built to last 100 lifetimes. The ballista rewrote that ambition in weeks. History recounts sieges that collapsed not from hunger or treachery, but from the singing teeth of ballistae, biting through walls and spirit alike. At Masada, a desert fortress perched on a plateau, Roman engineers dragged ballistae up earthen ramps. Each bolt loosened the stubborn defiance of stone. Witnesses described the night sky as raining fangs, glowing with pitch and divine malice. In Carthage, after days of fighting through city streets, ballistae were turned horizontally, not to breach walls, but to destroy morale. Bolts thundered down alleyways like divine warnings. Stone became ash. Doorways became splinters. Civilians fled not from soldiers, but from the sound. At Alesia. Julius Caesar's siege was more than tactical brilliance. Ballistae formed a second army of shadows. When Gallic reinforcements approached, the machines spat iron across the hills. One historian notes, the gods themselves turned their gaze. Even the Ptes, Temple of Jerusalem, sacred and revered, could not resist. Though titanic in stone and spirit, its defenders spoke of weapons that cracked more than marble. They cracked will. What made these sieges legendary wasn't just the outcome, but the artistry of destruction. Engineers sculpted collapse. They mapped fault lines in walls like healers reading veins, then directed ballista fire as if prescribing death. In some records, captured cities retained the bolts, mounting them on archways or embedding them in victory murals, not as shame, but as proof that they had withstood Rome's thunder. But more often, the bolts were missing, removed perhaps by those who believed their power lingered. Modern excavations have unearthed ballista bolts lodged in impossible places, behind collapsed vaults, beneath altar stones, through reinforced cisterns, each one a signature, a frozen scream, a timestamp in iron, and always, beside them, signs of sudden exodus. Because when ballistae sang, fortresses didn't fall. They remembered. Even thunder tires. As the centuries waned, so too did the voice of the ballista, not in failure, but in obsolescence, the victim not of conquest, but of innovation. The enemies Rome once crushed now mimicked her tactics. Fortifications thickened. Shield formations adapted. Mobility became king, and the ballista, with its bulk and elegance, became too ceremonial for chaos. Gunpowder loomed. No longer was torsion the peak of ranged power. Black powder, crude but potent, sang its own song. Louder, faster, deadlier. Ballistae, with their sacred ropes and crafted bolts, seemed like monks at a riot. Too slow to load, too regal to rush. And yet they lingered. In barter forts, engineers still taught the old ways. In desert campaigns, where powder failed in heat and sand, the ballista found second breath. A resurgence of silence, of tension over explosion, but it was not to last. The manuals became rarer, the rituals forgotten, coils cracked from neglect. The magisters died without heirs. One by one, the ballistae were moved to corners, then to storerooms, then to oblivion. Some say the last recorded use of a Roman ballista was not in war, but in tribute. At a funeral pyre of a general, his men fired one final bolt into the sea. No target, no enemy, just memory. It is said the bolt never landed, and thus faded the choir of thunder, not in flame nor failure, but in echo gero. In the soil of forgotten wars, ballistae still speak. Archaeologists brushing away centuries of dust have unearthed more than iron and rope. They've uncovered intent, a kind of frozen purpose carved into every gear, pin, and bolt. At Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, a perfectly preserved bolt lay lodged in a wooden beam. The wood, carbonized but intact, bore the impression of runes, not Roman script, but something older. Perhaps local, perhaps mystical. No one agrees. In Tunisia, deep beneath the ruins of Carthage, a storage vault was discovered. Inside, 2 ballista arms, still bound in ceremonial cloth. The linen had fused with time, and the color faded, but the scent of burned pitch still lingered. Faint, bitter, unforgettable. Each archaeological find is a whisper, and the scientists are priests of memory, divining stories from angles, tensions, and fractures. One such scholar, upon examining a cracked frame fragment, noted the grain split not from decay, but from an explosion of precision, as if the machine itself chose to rupture rather than be captured. Even in Rome's forums, beneath marble promenades and beneath basilica foundations, cores of ancient ballistae have been discovered, not in military depots, but in shrines, offerings. Ballistae, it seems, were not discarded. They were buried. Some inscriptions on bronze, locking mechanisms, reference gods lost to time. Vorton, Ilmars, Sibius, names not found in standard Roman pantheons. Speculation abounds. Were these deified machines, or the names of builders whose legacy became myth? A bolt tip discovered in Syria bore microscopic carvings, a story, too small for the naked eye, but clear under lens. A hunt, a betrayal, a redemption. The bolt, scholars suggest, was not just a weapon, but a confession. Even today, ballista parts resist rust, perhaps from oil, perhaps from the care of their keepers, or perhaps, as some whisper, they do not want to be forgotten. These echoes, half metal, half memory, insist on being heard, not by ears, but by reverence. Though centuries have passed, the ballista has not forgotten. Its blueprints echo in modern artillery. Its arcs whisper in the curves of missiles. Its launch beds live on in railgun cradles and torsion recoil suppressors. But more than form or function, the ballista left behind a philosophy. That destruction, when ritualized, becomes divine. Museums now house replicas. Schools teach its principles. Filmmakers reimagine its silhouette as silhouette of dread, but none of these quite captured the reverence that once wrapped around its limbs like sacred rope. Modern engineers marvel at the precision achieved without steel bearings, without computers. How could hands guided by candlelight create something that could split sky and shield alike? Because it wasn't just hands, it was belief. A belief that war had shape, that violence could be elegant, that the gods of iron demanded choreography, not chaos. In retrospection, the ballista teaches not only of power, but of pause. Before each shot, there was breath, a checking of coils, a shared look among the crew, a silence before the shout. Perhaps that is why it endures in memory, not as monster, but as a monument to design, to discipline, to dread wrapped in dignity. When we stare at the rusted fragments behind museum glass, we do not just see metal. We see a world where machines prayed before they killed. And we wonder, do ours still?